Hello, everyone. This is Janko Castro. Welcome to the QX Financial Podcast. All right, welcome, everybody. Today, I have a very interesting topic to talk with you about. Last week, we posted a video about will income taxes go up in the future? And we got a lot of emails, a lot of questions about some of the claims and some of the statements that I was making in that video. So I figure the podcast will be a better way to really expand on some of these ideas that I was discussing as to whether income taxes in particular will go up in the future for us millennials, Gen Zs, more so than older individuals, even though it will potentially affect them. So, in trying to explain why we believe this is the case, I wanted to create a framework, a comparison contrast. And one of the things that people don't realize is that we have been in this situation before historically. This is not the first time where we have had in the United States over 100% of GDP debt to income ratio or debt to GDP ratio. I'm sorry. This is not the first time this has happened. So I figured it will be useful, I hope, for a lot of you listening to this to understand why we believe this is going to happen in the future, income taxes going up, and also what points of references we're using as investors or as financial planners or financial professionals, what points of reference we are using for us to make that assessment. Obviously, we can be wrong. Obviously, I don't own the truth. This is a very educated opinion, an opinion nonetheless, even though it's an educated one. So the advice and the ideas that we're sharing with the public are based on some of these data points and these historical parallels that we can see, right? And compared to where we've been in the past, and then what solutions we took back in those days, and how can those solutions come back and reappear themselves. As a matter of fact, I like to use 1929 as an example. For those of you that do not know this, 1929, the Great Depression, as a parallel of the Great Recession in 2008. And I like to use that example because we rediscovered some tools that were not used in 1929 that were indeed used in 2008 that prevented the Great Recession from becoming a depression. And I use it as a theoretical framework to explain that history is helpful, especially economic history, and we should be open to understanding what decisions were made in the past and why, and how can those decisions or those events can repeat themselves now and in the future. Anyway, so that's kind of my idea, and I figured the podcast is a better medium to use this since we have a little bit more time to talk instead of a 5 or 10 minute video. And so I want to start with talking about what is driving the deficit, right? Why do we have so much debt? And I won't give you the whole story, but literally since the 1980s, we went from being a creditor nation, in other words, a nation that had a surplus and was lending money to others, to being a borrower nation, right? That means that we're taking money borrowing from the world and borrowing from ourselves to finance some of the things that we do. Now, this is possible for a lot of reasons. The U.S. economy is very large. We have advantages that other countries do not have. But one of the biggest myths that I hear out there is that the U.S., because of all this borrowing, we're going to end up like Greece. I will say that is highly unlikely. And for those of you that don't know, back in 2012, Greece, instead of the Eurozone, had a debt problem. You saw the same thing in Mexico in 94. You saw the same thing in Argentina in 2001. We had debt crisis. The Asian debt crisis of 97, 98 comes to mind as well. All those countries got into debt because investors did not believe they could pay them, and they pretty much dropped their currencies. But in the United States, we have a tremendous advantage, not only the size of our economy, but that the US dollar is the world's currency. So it is much less likely that all of a sudden everybody's going to drop the dollar and go somewhere else, and mostly because there's no other options. Probably that, monetary policy could be another topic for a huge podcast. That's not the topic of today. But suffices to know that there are very few to no options or alternatives, I should say, to the US dollar in the world economy today. So that's one of the reasons why we are allowed to borrow so much. So what's driving that borrowing? Well, we have the annual deficit. Every year we're borrowing money like crazy to pad the budget. And that is increasing the national debt. When I started going to college back in 2003 and 4, I think that it was over 7 trillion, and now we're over 27 trillion. 24 trillion as of October the 4th, 2020. So it's been a ride. We've been borrowing like crazy for the last 15, 20 years. And honestly, we have very little to show for it as far as infrastructure and other investments. But again, that's probably the conversation for another podcast. The point is that we've been doing it, and that is driving the budget is driving the deficit. So does that automatically means that we're going to have a debt crisis, that we're going to go into, again, a Greece, a Mexico, an Argentina in the future? Again, not necessarily, but there are some some historical parallels that we can use, and the best example that I can give you is us. Us in the United States, we ourselves, we were in this situation back in 1945. 1945, the end of the Second World War. We were, how do we call ourselves? The factory for democracy or something along those lines. We were providing money, goods and services to other nations to be able to fight the war, and eventually we won the war, which is great. That was a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But we spent a lot of money to be able to do it, and the same with other countries. So we found ourselves in 1945 in a situation where we had over 100%, I think it was 112, 108% of debt to GDP ratio. And obviously that was considered dangerous, which it was, probably, especially at that point in time. The US dollar had not cemented yet itself as the global currency. So there were some concerns with that. So the question then becomes, okay, how do we get out of it? How do we go from 110% GDP to debt ratio, or debt to GDP ratio, to becoming a creditor nation and then not having that problem anymore? Well, we did three fundamental things. First, we actually did increase taxes. That is a part of the story that most people don't realize. Now, you have to understand that in the United States, we have what is called a progressive tax system, meaning that when it comes to income taxes, that is, you actually pay less income tax, or you potentially pay no income tax at all if you have a lower income. And as your income goes up, then you are responsible for a higher share of your income in income taxes. Yeah, that's the nature of a progressive system. So we did that. We did that very effectively. Again, we actually were able to raise taxes all the way to 94%. So that means that if you were making over $200,000 a year back in 1950, you were paying over 90% of your income in taxes. It sounds crazy to think about it today, because again, people my age, I'm in my 30s, we were born in one of the lowest income tax environments we've ever had historically. So it's crazy to think that if you were successful, you were paying 90% of your income in taxes. And it's true. It happened. As a matter of fact, when I speak with my clients, I like to joke about the Beatles. I'm a Beatles fan. I'm a musician as well. I think you guys know this. So in 1966, George Harrison wrote a song called Taxman. And the reason why he wrote it was because they were paying over 90% of their income as the Beatles. They were very successful in taxes back in Britain, because Britain had the same issue that the United States had at the time. They were trying to get out of the debt that they incurred during the war. So again, we were in that boat. But taxation was not the only policy option that the country had. Besides taxation, also we allow inflation to run a little crazier. I think we have allowed inflation. Our inflation goal this year is to between 2 and 3%, definitely much less than 3%. In the 50s and 60s, we allowed that inflation to run up a little faster. Some people make the claim that that policy of pump priming and allowing inflation to run a little faster ended up in the inflation problems of the late 1970s, and that very well might be true. That's not the point of this podcast. But during the 40s, 50s, and 60s, and early 70s, we allow inflation to run a little bit higher, and in doing so, devaluing the value of the debt, making it easy for the debt to income or GDP to debt ratio to go down. So we allow inflation. We had higher levels of taxation, and the last leg of this tool was growth. We also did massive investments in the overall economy that allow the country to grow. So the interstate highway system comes to mind. The investments that we did in the military bases all across the United States in the 1950s and 1960s. The moon program comes to mind as well. So we increased spending because we increased taxation, and that allowed growth to run much higher. As a matter of fact, a lot of people still cites the 1945 to 1973 period as kind of like the golden age of economic growth in the United States. I think with the only exception of the 2009-2020 bull market, it was the second largest growth environment as far as income and jobs and unemployment that we ever had in the U.S. in the 20 and 21st century. So a very important period. So those three things were the policy solutions that we found to get out of the debt problem: inflation, taxation, and high levels of growth. In 1964, we changed the Immigration Act, allowing more people to come in. That means the labor market expanded. Everything kind of went well during during that period. Higher productivity, increase in GDP growth, more globalization. That's when the whole process started in the early 70s, and eventually we ended up liberalizing financial markets, and that's where we are today. So that's a long story that is beyond the scope of this podcast again. But those were the three policy solutions. But as the 1980s came about, then we decided to go the other way. We decided to decrease income taxes and actually not decrease spending. So we increased spending in the 1980s. At the same time, we allowed income taxes to fall. And in doing so, we paid the difference with debt. As financial markets globalized, there was a huge appetite for U.S. debt, and we were able to use that appetite to finance the budget without having to increase taxes. As a matter of fact, as I said, we actually went the other way. So the history of my lifetime, 80s, 90s, early 2000s, is the expansion of public spending, but financed not with taxes or growth for that matter, mostly financed with more debt. And that's how we went from $7 or $4 trillion in debt all the way to 24 in less than a generation, in half a generation. So that's how it happened. Obviously this creates a lot of problems. Or we foresee that this may create a lot of problems. I don't think is a point of today to really talk about what those problems can be, because I wanted to focus the conversation on will income taxes go up in the future? And I think the answer is yes, because I think the policy mix that is coming for the next 20 to 25 years is going to be a similar mix of policy solutions that we did back in the 40s and back in the 50s. Increases in growth, increases allow inflation to go up a little higher, and also definitely higher levels of taxation. Now there is one component that we really haven't talked about that I mentioned briefly when I talked about the Immigration Act of 1965, which is demographics. In the United States, we have a very young country in 1945. Is not the case of today. So we have more retirees for every person that is working. So that means that our debt when it comes to Medicare and Social Security is also going to be a gigantic problem and also be part of the deficit. In other words, we have more social benefits that needs to be financed today than we had in 1945. In 1945, we did not have Medicare. In 1945, we did not have Medicare Part D, I think it is, or whatever is the part for prescription drugs. That was signed in 2003, I believe. The expansion of prescription drugs for Medicare recipients. We didn't have a lot of programs that we have today that also put a lot of pressure on the deficit. So again, we don't have as many young people working. We have more retirees working, and people that are retired also are living longer. So as you can see, the pressure on the country's finances is now coming from a lot of different angles. So anyway, so let's go back to this idea of, will taxes go back in the future? Well, I think they will, because they're gonna be part of the policy mix. Now let me say something else about taxes here, because in the debate today, this might be a little controversial, but it's not. It's just the math. I think the debate today gets lost in ideological positionings, whether you're conservative or liberal, progressive, whatever. I don't really have any patience for either of the two arguments from an ideological perspective. We want to be practical, right? But one of the things that get lost in the debate is that sometimes people say, well, but the lower income people pay no taxes, and that is not true. Lower income people pay very little income taxes. That is true. But when you look at the overall tax receipts that we pay, sales tax, property tax, income tax, and so on, you'll see that about 80%, about 50% of the people of the lower income, in the lower income areas, pay about 56% of the overall tax revenue into the U.S. Treasury, whereas 10% of the people own about 80% of the country's wealth. So it's not an even split. And that's what now economists are calling income inequality, right? You have a situation where the majority of the wealth of the country is owned by the top 10% of income earners, but they're not paying an equivalent share of their income as part of the tax mix. They pay a lot of income taxes, that is true, but they're not paying a lot of everything else. Again, there's different reasons for that, but I wanted to make that point clear, that this idea that always because people that are workers are not paying enough in taxes, or they're not paying anything because they're freeloaders or whatever, that is simply not true. So again, let's make sure that we don't get lost in the political debate or ideological debate, and we actually look at the data. So anyway, so going back to the income tax thing, what are the country's options? So we are in this situation where we have to continue borrowing money for the foreseeable future. There's no political will right now, and it shouldn't be, because the economic situation we have right now, to balance the budget. So that's not going to happen anytime soon. So what are the country's options? What can the U.S. continue to do to continue to borrow? And the way that I use to explain this is very simple. I want you to think of the country's finances as your own personal finances, right? So imagine it this way. Let's say that you are making $2,000 a month, right? But your expenses are $2,500 a month. If this was you in real life, how will you cover the difference, right? So I'm making 2,000, I need 2,500, so I'm short every month. How will you make up the difference? Well, first option will be to borrow, right? Run the credit card, just borrow the money to pay up additional expenses. And that's exactly what we're doing as a country. It's just that instead of calling it borrowing, we call it bonds, right? So we issue U.S. Treasuries every year, and we continue to run the credit card. Now, are there any other options? Sure, yeah. The other option is we can spend our savings, sell assets, spend your savings. And we kind of did that already. We already spent the Social Security Trust Fund. We already spent the Medicare Trust Fund. Most buildings owned by the government are leases. I mean, short of giving up national lands and the national parks, we have spent a big majority of our assets to finance our debt. So there's really not much there. Like I said, unless we start selling our land to other countries, which we're not going to do, right? So a lot of that is already gone, especially our cash accounts. The other option will be to work more if you want to balance that budget. And really, the government doesn't create any goods and services. The government cannot create wealth. It can only take wealth from those that creates it. And that's the way they do it is via taxation. So as you can see, that I go back to taxes. It goes back as to part of the policy mix, right? They can just finance it with taking more money from people. And the other option, so we have borrow, we have working more, we have selling assets. Your other option as a household will be to actually make a budget, right? Okay, let's stop spending $2,500 a month. Let's go back to $2,000 a month. And that will make sense. But here is where politics get on the way. And what I explain to people is that for us to be able to balance the budget, we will have to talk about the two largest items in the budget. 2/3 of the U.S. budget, of the annual government U.S. budget, is Social Security, Medicare, and the U.S. military. So if we collect $3 trillion a year, $2 trillion gets spent in the military and Social Security and Medicare. So for you to reduce those expenses, we will have to go to Grandpa and say, hey, Grandpa, we got to cut your benefits. Is that going to happen? No. And the biggest reason why that's not going to happen is because the people who vote in this country are not the 17-year-olds, are not the 25-year-olds, are the over 55-year-olds. They are the ones who vote by a lot. I mean, don't quote me on these numbers, but it was something like this. In the last election in 2016, about over 60% of the people over 50 voted, and only 18% or 14% of the people under 30 actually went to vote. So it's just, you see a massive difference. So if you're a politician, the last thing you want to do is tell retirees, we're going to have to cut your Social Security. So I don't see that happening anytime soon at all. And that's why I'm so bearish, let's say, as to can we come up with a compromise on the deficit. I don't think so. At least not in the short term, nor in the midterm. The politics will have to change for that to change. So as far as the eye can see, we're going to continue to borrow. And if we don't have the will to raise taxes, then we're going to continue to build the deficit. Now, last point on this. There is one thing the government can do that you and I cannot do in our household financing. They have one option that you and I don't have, and that is printing money. Literally, the U.S. Mint, the U.S. Treasury can just print more dollars, right? Now, unfortunately, if they print more money than the economy grows, what's going to happen is you're going to have something we call inflation. And inflation, as famously Mr. Milton Friedman said, inflation is a monetary phenomenon. It's not about wages. It's not about government spending. It's a monetary phenomenon. The more money you have circulating and you don't have enough growth, then you're going to have inflation. And inflation is nothing but a hidden tax. It's a shadow tax because the way our progressive tax system works. Think of it this way. If you're making right now $100,000 a year, and you allow inflation to go from 3 to 7%, for example, that just means that in 10 years, you're going to have to earn $200,000. You're going to have to earn twice as much money in terms of dollars, nominal dollars, to have the same lifestyle that you had at $100,000 10 years prior. See? So you're making more money in paper, but your lifestyle didn't change a bit. So that's what inflation creates. The problem is that income tax brackets are not indexed to inflation. So that means that in the eyes of the IRS, now you're making $200,000, even though your lifestyle is not any higher, but you're going to have to pay a higher percentage of your income because now you're in a higher tax bracket. because tax rates are not indexed to inflation. Therefore, you make more money in terms of dollars. Guess what? You're going to have to pay a higher share of your income in taxes. And in doing so, in practice, you're going to end up with an even lower lifestyle than you had at 100,000. You see, income tax brackets get set by Congress. It's a political process. Inflation is a monetary executive branch process. The government can just decide to print more money without any political accountability. That's harder to do in the tax area. So what happens is, in the end, what happens in practice is money runs faster than our ability to adjust our progressive tax system to the new reality. Therefore, you will pay a higher share of your income in taxes. And again, that's exactly what happened in the 50s, 60s, and early 70s. So hopefully this historical parallel, guys, was helpful at all. I tried to share with you two concepts: the historical concept, the historical parallel of where we were in 1945, and give you 2 or 3 reasons why we believe taxes will go up. Because that's really the only option the government has as far as the eye can see for the moment. Because even if we allow inflation to run, it's also going to increase your taxes. And also because we have a demographic problem. We have more people heading into retirement that are actually working. So we may find ourselves over the next 25 years, just like Japan, where you have one person working and you have one person retired. So how do you make up the difference and also still be able to make the investment that you need in the economy, infrastructure, education, and so on? You're gonna have to borrow it. So our concern is that we're taking too much of an advantage of the unique position we have with the US dollar being the world's currency, and that can mean trouble for the future. Higher inflation, higher taxes, and lower investment overall in the economy, making it harder for the Federal Reserve and for the government to respond to any future financial crisis and be able to smooth out the business cycle. So I wish I had better news for you today. I know I throw the sink at you with facts and figures and some concepts, but I really wanted to maximize our time today and give you a logical academic foundation, if I can call it that, as to why we believe income taxes are going to be an issue in the future. So we continue to advise our clients to find tax advantage strategies so that they can protect themselves for whatever happens in the future. If anything, they can grandfather themselves in some of the tax benefits that currently exist in the tax code, so that if income taxes go up in the future, if we're trying to figure out how to tax more other financial assets, you have a level of protection that will probably go away if you don't take action now, in my view. So anyway, thank you so much, guys, for listening to our podcast today. If you found this helpful, feel free to leave a comment. Let us know what you think. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have, give you some resources to look up this information and be able to make your own decisions and develop your own worldview. Obviously, like I said earlier, we don't own the truth. All we can do is have an educated guess, and we give our recommendations based on what we see and based on what historical or economic history parallels we can find out there to make an assessment of what we believe can happen in the future. Thank you so much. I look forward to seeing you guys on the next episode. Take care.